In the city of Nauvoo, Illinois, there is a pioneer memorial containing thousands of names of the refugees who died on the trail to the Rocky Mountains. Nearly every family who fled Nauvoo suffered loss, heartache, and hardship. This is the story of the first exploratory company of Mormon pioneers who traveled to the Great Salt Lake Valley as told primarily through Orson Pratt's daily journal. I arrived in Kirtland April 26, 1834, and there met Joseph and Hiram Smith in the street. I was introduced to Joseph Smith. It was the first time that I had ever seen him in my life. He invited me home to spend the Sabbath with him, and I did so. They had meeting on Sunday. On Sunday night, the prophet called on all who held the priesthood to gather into the little log schoolhouse they had there. It was a small house, perhaps 14 feet square, but it held the whole of the priesthood of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who were then in the town of Kirtland, and who had gathered together to go off on Zion's camp. That was the first time I ever saw Oliver Cowdery or heard him speak. The first time I ever saw Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball, and the two Pratts, and Orson Hyde and many others. There were no apostles in the church then except Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery. When we got together, the prophet called upon the elders of Israel with him to bear testimony of this work. Those that I have named spoke, and a good many I have not named bore their testimony. When they got through, the prophet said, "Brethren, I have been very much edified and instructed by your testimonies here tonight. But I want to say to you before the Lord that you know no more concerning the destinies of this church and kingdom than a babe upon its mother's lap. You don't comprehend it." I was rather surprised. He said, "It is only a little handful of the priesthood you see here tonight. But this church will fill North and South America. It will fill the world. Among other things, he said, it will fill the Rocky Mountains. There will be tens of thousands of Latter-day Saints who will be gathered in the Rocky Mountains. And there they will open the door for the establishing of the gospel among the Lamanites, who will receive the gospel and their endowments, and the blessings of God. This people will go into the Rocky Mountains. They will there build temples to the Most High. They will raise up a posterity there. And the Latter-day Saints who dwell in these mountains will stand in the flesh until the coming of the Son of Man. The Son of Man will come to them while in the Rocky Mountains." I prophesied that the saints would continue to suffer much affliction and would be driven to the Rocky Mountains, and many would apostatize. Others would be put to death by our persecutors or lose their lives in consequence of exposure or disease. And some of you will live to go and assist in making settlements and build cities, and see the saints become a mighty people in the midst of the Rocky Mountains. On the 14th of July, 1843, with quite a number of his brethren, Joseph Smith crossed the Mississippi River to the town of Montrose to be present at the installment of the Masonic Lodge of the Rising Sun. A block schoolhouse had been prepared with shade in front, under which was a barrel of ice water. Judge George Adams was the highest Masonic authority in the state of Illinois, and had been sent there to organize this lodge. He, Hiram Smith, and J.C. Bennett, being high Masons, went into the house to perform some ceremonies which the others were not entitled to witness. These, including Joseph Smith, remained under the Bowery. Joseph, as he was tasting the cold water, warned the brethren to not be too free with it. With the tumbler still in his hand, he prophesied that the saints would yet go to the Rocky Mountains. And, said he, this water tastes much like that of the crystal streams that are running from the snow-capped mountains. We will let Mr. Anson Call describe this prophetic scene. I had before seen him in a vision, and now saw while he was talking. His countenance changed to white. Not the deadly white of a bloodless face, but a living, brilliant white. He seemed absorbed in gazing at something at a great distance, and said, I am gazing upon the valleys of those mountains. This was followed by a vivid description of the scenery of these mountains, as I have since become acquainted with it. Pointing to Shadrach, Roundy, and others, he said, there are some men here who shall do a great work in that land. Pointing to me, he said, there is Anson. He shall go and shall assist in building cities from one end of the country to the other. And you, rather extending the idea to all those he had spoken of, shall perform a great work as has been done by man, so that the nations of the earth shall be astonished, and many of them will be gathered in that land, and assist in building cities and temples, and Israel shall be made to rejoice. It is impossible to represent in words this scene which is still vivid in my mind, of the grandeur of Joseph's appearance. His beautiful descriptions of this land and his wonderful prophetic utterances as they emanated from the glorious inspirations that overshadowed him. There was a force and power in his exclamations of which the following is but a faint echo. Oh, the beauty of those snow-capped mountains! The cool, refreshing streams that are running down through those mountain gorges. Then gazing in another direction, as if there was a change in locality. Oh, the scenes that this people will pass through, the dead that will lay between here and there. Then turning in another direction as if the scene had again changed. Oh, the apostasy that will take place before my brethren reach that land. But he continued, the priesthood shall prevail over all its enemies, triumph over the devil, and be established upon the earth, never more to be thrown down. He then charged us with great force and power to be faithful in those things that had been and should be committed to our charge, with the promise that all the blessings that the priesthood could bestow. Remember these things and treasure them up. Amen. In the journal history, President Brigham Young, under the date of the 27th, states, in the evening I went to the temple and met with brothers Heber C. Kimball, Parley Pratt, Orson Pratt, Amos C. Lyman, and George A. Smith. We retired to my room for prayer at 6:45 p.m. After prayers, the general conversation ensued. The visit of the Marshal and the immigration to California were the prominent topics. Elder Parley P. Pratt read from Hastings' account of California. President Young continues, the labors of the day having been brought to a close at so early an hour, 8:30, it was thought proper to have a little season of recreation. Accordingly, Brother Hanson was invited to produce his violin, which he did and played several lively airs, accompanied by Elisha Averett and his flute. Among some others, some very good lively dancing tunes. This was too much for the gravity of Brother Joseph Young, who indulged in dancing to a hornpipe, and was soon joined by several others. And before the dance was over, several French fours were indulged in. The first was opened by myself with Sister Whitney, and Elder Kimball and partner. The spirit of dancing was increased until the whole floor was covered with dancers, and while we danced before the Lord, we shook the dust from our feet as a testimony against this nation. After the dancing had continued about an hour, Several excellent songs were sung in which the brethren and sisters joined. The Upper California was sung by Erastus Snow, after which I called upon Sister Whitney, who stood up and, invoking the gift of tongues, sang a beautiful song of Zion in tongues. The interpretation was given by her husband, Bishop Whitney, and me. It related to our efforts to build this house to the privilege we now have of meeting in it. Our departure shortly to the country of the Lamanites, their rejoicing when they hear the gospel, and of the gathering of Israel. The speaking in tongues and their interpretation verifies what the prophet Joseph stated, as related by Wilford Woodruff and Anson Call. Extracts from the private journal of Orson Pratt. After the martyrdom of Joseph and Hiram Smith at Carthage in June 1844, the saints continued to receive persecutions from the murderers of their prophet and patriarch. Frequently their hard-earned crops were destroyed, their stacks of grain burned, their cattle shot, their houses torn down and burned, and their lives constantly threatened. Many of the saints were whipped and others murdered in cold blood. These murderers received no check from the authorities of Illinois, boldly threatening a general massacre of men, women, and children, unless they would leave their houses, homes, and firesides, and depart out of the United States, and seek an asylum in the wild, inhospitable regions of the Rocky Mountains. The saints, having endured for many years during their residence in Missouri the most heart-rending persecutions, and knowing from bitter experience that the government would not extend to them the protection promised in her Constitution, concluded to depart from her midst, and seek out a location in the vast interior wilds of the West, far from the abodes of what is falsely termed civilization and Christianity. Accordingly, in the forepart of February 1846, several hundred families of the saints left their farms and their warm, comfortable brick houses unsold, and crossed with their wagons the great Mississippi River. Many of our wagons crossed by the ferry boat, but the weather becoming intensely cold, the broad Mississippi River froze over, forming a bridge of ice on which many hundreds crossed. In consequence of the deep snows and the extreme cold, we were obliged to form an encampment for several days at Sugar Creek, a few miles west of the river. While here, the thermometer for several days was far below the freezing point. Men, women, and children and animals suffered severely with the cold. Notwithstanding the snowstorms and the inclemency of the weather, our camp resounded with songs of joy and praise to God. All were cheerful and happy in the anticipation of finding a resting place from persecution in some of the lonely, solitary valleys of the great interior basin of Upper California, then a Mexican province, or whithersoever we might be led. During our stay at Sugar Creek, I obtained by means of a quadrant and an artificial horizon of quicksilver a meridian observation of the sun, from which I deduced the latitude of the camp and found the same to be 40 degrees 32 minutes. From previous observations, I have determined the latitude and longitude of the temple at Nauvoo, the latitude being 40 degrees 35 minutes and 48 seconds, the longitude 91 degrees 10 minutes and 45 seconds. It now became quite a difficulty to sustain our numerous cattle and horses, for it required many hundreds of bushels of grain daily to keep them from perishing. But we had not yet launched forth into regions altogether uninhabited. We were unable to buy large quantities of Indian corn from time to time, with money, labor, etc. We have now been encamped out nearly a month, suffering hardships and privations. But yet we are cheerful and rejoice that we have the privilege of passing through tribulations for the truth's sake. March the 1st. This afternoon the general camp moved about 5 miles to the northwest. After scraping away the snow, we pitched our tents upon the hard frozen ground. and after building up large fires in front, we found ourselves as comfortable as circumstances would permit. Our beds were placed upon the frozen earth, and after bowing before our great Creator, and offering up praise and thanksgiving to Him, and imploring His protection, we resigned ourselves to the slumbers of the night. Previous to my retirement, the sky being clear, I obtained the altitude of the North Polar Star, from which I determined the latitude of the camp to be 40 degrees, 34 minutes, and 52 seconds. The weather is rather more moderate than for a few weeks past. At midnight, the thermometer stood at 28 degrees Fahrenheit. March the 2nd. The morning camp moved in a westerly direction. The roads being rough and bad, some wagons were broken. In the evening, encamped on the east bank of the Des Moines River, 4 miles below the little village of Farmington. March the 3rd. The morning is rather cold. The thermometer standing at 7 o'clock at 23 degrees. The camp moved forward, following up the general course of the river. About 8 miles, when night approaching, we pitched our tents. The ground having thawed during the day, the place of our encampment is quite muddy, which renders it unpleasant to those who sleep upon the ground. The evening being beautiful and pleasant, I obtained a meridian observation of Sirius, the dog star, which determined the latitude to be 40 degrees, 42 minutes, and 26 seconds. March the 4th. At 8 o'clock this morning, the thermometer stood at 43 degrees. The roads being muddy and some wagons and harness broken, it was concluded to remain until the next day. In the meantime, our mechanics were busily engaged in repairing wagons. By the earnest solicitations of the citizens of Farmington, the band of music from our camp visited them and gave them a concert, much to their satisfaction. March the 5th. Today, most of the camp moved on, fording the river at Bonaparte's Mill. The roads in many places are almost impassable on account of the mud. Some teams are unable to draw their loads in bad places without assistance. Some wagons were broken. A portion of the camp were forced to stop on account of the roads. Others proceeded on about 12 miles to Indian Creek, where they stopped until the next day. It being dark when we arrived at this creek, we pitched our tents in a wet, swampy place. The next morning, some removed the wagons and tents onto drier ground, while others continued their journey. Thus our camp began to be somewhat scattered. March the 10th. Our company moved on about 10 miles and encamped, the roads being exceedingly bad. We waited here about 10 days for the main body of the camp, who were unable to proceed on account of the deep mud. We are very much scattered at the present. Many are engaging in work in the thinly scattered settlements to obtain food both for themselves and their animals. It was found necessary to exchange our horses for oxen, as the latter would endure the journey much better than the horses. Many have already been exchanged. March 22nd. The day is rainy and unpleasant. Moved only about 7 miles. The next day went through the rain and deep mud about 6 miles and encamped upon the west branch of Shoal Creek. The heavy rains had rendered the prairies impassable, and our several camps were very much separated from each other. We were compelled to remain as we were for some 2 or 3 weeks, during which time our animals were fed upon the limbs and barks of trees, for the grass had not yet started, and we were a number of miles from any inhabited country, and therefore it was very inconvenient to send for grain. The heavy rains and snows, together with the frosty nights, rendered our situation very uncomfortable. Our camps were now more perfectly organized, and captains were appointed over hundreds, over 50s, over 10s, and over all these a president and councilors, together with other necessary officers. Game is now quite plentiful. Our hunters bring into camp more or less deer, wild turkeys, and prairie hens every day. April 5th. It being Sunday, a portion of our camp met together to offer up our sacrament to the Most High. After a few remarks by myself and Bishop Miller, we proceeded to break bread and administer the holy ordinance of the Lord's Supper. At 6 o'clock in the evening, we met with the captains of companies to make some arrangements for sending 12 or 14 miles to the settlements for corn to sustain our animals. April 6th. This morning, at the usual hour of prayer, we bowed before the Lord with thankful hearts, it being just 16 years since the organization of this church, and we were truly grateful for the many manifestations of the goodness of God towards us as a people. The weather is still wet and rainy. 9 or 10 wagons with 4 yoke of oxen each have started this morning for the settlements to obtain corn. In the evening they were visited by a heavy thunderstorm, accompanied by high wind and hail. Most of the tents were pitched upon high ground were blown down, and the inmates exposed to the fury of the storm. The water in Shoal Creek arose in a very few minutes several feet in height, and threatened to overflow its banks and disturb our tents. April the 8th. Our teams, which were sent 3 days ago after corn, returned, the most of them empty, and we find it very difficult to sustain our teams. April 11th. During the night the mud froze hard. To any but saints our circumstances would have been very discouraging, for it seemed to be with the greatest difficulty that we could preserve our animals from actual starvation, and we were obliged to send off several days' journey to the Missouri settlements on the south to procure grain. Many of the people were nearly destitute of food, and many women and children suffered much from exposure, due to the inclemency of the weather, and from the lack of the necessaries of life, such as they were in former times accustomed to enjoy. But in the midst of all these temporal afflictions, the saints were comforted in anticipation of better days. They looked forward to the time when these light afflictions would cease, and when they should have the privilege of sitting under their own vine and fig trees, with none to molest them or make them afraid. They were willing to endure hardships and privations for the sake of escaping the unrelenting persecutions of the Gentile Christians, from whom they had received for many years nothing but cruelty and the most heart-rending oppression. Their desire was to establish themselves in some lonely valley of the mountains, in some sequestered spot where they and their children could worship God and obey His voice, and prepare themselves for the glory which is to be revealed at the revelation of Jesus Christ. With these glorious anticipations, cheerfulness and joy seemed to animate every countenance, and sufferings were endured without murmuring. The 12 and others of the authorities met in council, and determined to leave the settlement still further on our left, and launched forth upon the broad prairies in the northwest, which were hundreds of miles entirely uninhabited. April 24th. Yesterday we traveled about 8 miles, today 6 miles. We came to a place which we named Garden Grove. At this point we determined to form a small settlement, and open farms for the benefit of the poor, and such as were unable at present to pursue their journey further, and also for the benefit of the poor who were yet behind. May the 10th. A large amount of labor had been done since arriving in this grove. Indeed, the whole camp are very industrious. Many houses have been built, wells dug, extensive farms fenced, and the whole place assumes the appearance of having been occupied for years, and clearly shows what can be accomplished by union, industry, and perseverance. May the 11th. A portion of our camp again resumed our journey. Traveled about 6 miles and stopped for the night. We tarried here the next day. May the 16th. This morning at 4 o'clock I started out on foot and alone to hunt, and also to look at the country. I traveled about 10 miles to the south and found myself in the main branch of the Grand River. No game or wild animals of any description to be seen, having been thinned out by a tribe of Indians called the Potawatomis, whose trails and old camping grounds were to be seen in every direction. I returned again to camp, getting back about 12:30 o'clock, having traveled on foot upwards of 20 miles before breakfast. Parley P. Pratt, in the meantime, had some 4 miles to the west and found a very beautiful grove on the east bank of Grand River, on high ground, and we resolved forthwith to proceed to the same with our camp. We arrived a little after sunset, and turning our horses and cattle out to graze, we proceeded to fence in small dooryards in front for our tents, to prevent the cattle from soiling the same, as the ground was still muddy. May the 19th. The 12, with some others, went out several miles into the region round about to view the country. We found the same very broken and hilly, although well adapted to farming. We concluded to form another settlement here for the benefit of the poor, and such as were unable for the want of teams to proceed further. Accordingly, the camp commenced building houses, plowing, planting, and fencing in farms. An immense quantity of labor was performed in a very few days, and the place, in a short time, began to assume the appearance of an old settlement, the ground being more hilly and elevated than the prairies over which we had passed. We concluded to call the place Mount Pisgah. Toward the latter part of May, the most of the 12, with large companies, proceeded on in a westerly direction. I remained at Pisgah until the 7th of June. During my stay, many large companies arrived from Nauvoo, the most of whom passed on, a few stopping at the settlement. June the 7th. We left Pisgah, and after about 10 days, we succeeded in overtaking the main camp, not far from the northeast bank of the Missouri River, near Council Bluffs. Thus we had been upwards of 4 months in passing from Nauvoo to this place, at a season of the year the most difficult for traveling, and on account of the deep mud and rains. During this journey many have suffered extremely with exposure and the want of necessary food. Some whose constitutions being feeble were unable to endure, and sank down and died with their accumulated sufferings. But their blood will be required at the hands of the nation, who have looked on coldly, and seen them driven out without stretching out a friendly arm for their protection. The greater portion of the country over which we had passed is without inhabitants. Consequently, we have had our own roads and bridges to make. We were now on the lands owned by the Potawatomi Indians, whom we found very friendly. We were visited by the great chief of the tribe. He was an educated man and spoke English fluently. He said we were welcome among them, and kindly offered us the use of timber that grew upon their lands for fuel, or any other needful purpose. The whole tribe seemed very honorable, and treated us with the greatest of friendship. A branch of the American Fur Company was located here, under the superintendence of Mr. Sarpy, a wealthy merchant. By invitation, a large number of gentlemen and ladies from our camp, together with a band of music, visited the residence of the Indian agent, and gave a concert to many hundreds of the tribe. All seemed to enjoy themselves, and were full of life and gaiety. From this point, we were obliged to send down to Missouri, between 100 and 200 miles, to procure provisions to make a necessary fit-out for the Great Western Expedition. While waiting for provisions, we built a very good ferry boat for crossing the Missouri River. Many commenced the latter part of June to cross the Missouri. On the west side of the river we found the bluffs rise very abruptly, and it required a great deal of labor to construct a passable road. But by diligence and perseverance we soon overcame these obstacles. But another obstacle soon made its appearance, which seemed to completely hedge up our way from going any further this season.